Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
Every day, history is traded all over the world. Poignant, bizarre, and unique items that may never have been seen in public before. A fascinating and often untold tale lies behind every object.
It looks pretty gruesome, but actually the reality behind it is probably far more gruesome than the object itself.
This may be our last chance to see them before they disappear forever into private collections. Our quest? To unearth extraordinary objects drawn from every corner of the world and reveal the amazing hidden histories behind them.
My father was shot down by this man, Schnaufer. His plane is right at the top, the 29th of June, 1943.
On this episode of Trading History, one man's bizarre collection hits the market for the very first time.
This is one of the favourite pieces.
Never have I seen such an amazing collection.
Iconic dresses from one of the most popular royals the world has ever known.
When she walked into Prince Charles's study, he said to her, "What are you wearing that for? Our family only wears black when we're in mourning."
And a rare book from the most controversial games in Olympic history.
It is a time capsule of Olympic Games which have become so famous.
For many people, this was a ludicrous waste of money when people were still counting the loss of the war.
The plains of sub-Saharan Africa, the forests of Europe, and the oceans of Australasia. Once the living habitats of these preserved mammals, birds, and reptiles. Now, this rare 544-piece collection is up for sale.
Lots and lots of interest here. 3,000. Two again I'll take if you like.
It's the product of the ancient art of taxidermy. The controversial practice of preserving a body after it's dead.
Never have I seen such an amazing single-owner collection. A chance to see things that you will never see close up anywhere else. We've had inquiries from New Zealand, America, Australia, the continent obviously, people flying over from Germany at the weekend to come to the sale. It's going to be quite a special day.
The collection has come from this house and belongs to taxidermy dealer Nigel Poole.
This is one of the favourite pieces for obvious reasons. He came over from America.
Nigel has spent decades cramming it into every last bit of space. Recent renovation plans have forced Nigel to have a clear-out. But not everything's being sold. The rest of the house is still bulging with more taxidermy. Large and small. Nigel's fascination with taxidermy started back in the 1960s. Then, home furnishings were inspired by the space race, psychedelic colours and curves and shapes. At the time, Nigel was working in his father's antique shop.
On many occasions, we went to do house clearances, and because nobody wanted these stuffed animals, as they call them, there was actually no call for it, nobody was buying it, and it literally was taken away and burnt. And I used to do it with my father and think, this is an absolute crying shame. We were burning things that in some cases were well over 100 years old. You couldn't help but feel that you were actually burning history.
The origins of taxidermy date back to the early Egyptians, who used embalming techniques to preserve their pets and even themselves. Centuries later, it took on a different form.
It sort of kicks off in the 16th, 17th centuries with the cabinets of curiosities, the Wunderkammer. It's taxidermy in a sort of fairly broad sense. They did have stuffed birds in those days, but they're more hard-shelled carapaces like turtles or things like reptiles, crocodiles, chameleons, things that they could actually dry rather than stuff.
By the 19th century, techniques in Europe and North America had progressed. And instead of stuffing, taxidermists would construct a frame, create a plaster mold, and then stretch the animal skin over it. But without proper preservatives, none of the pieces lasted long. It was thanks to the work of French pharmacist Jean-Baptiste Biqueur in 1738 that taxidermy was saved from extinction.
He invented arsenic paste, which revolutionized taxidermy. At last, it could survive infestation, and it was worth doing. Before that, it was hardly worth stuffing a bird because it would only last a matter of months and it would be infested.
Sadly, that was the fate of the last dodo, whose mounted remains were displayed in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum until 1755.
When they inspected it and found it was infested, they put it on the bonfire and burnt it. Luckily, a curator salvaged the beak and a foot for the museum, but the last dodo was burnt.
Nigel's own collection also contains some rare animal specimens which survived the bonfire. Auctioneer Joe is in the process of cataloguing them.
This species, particularly Nyla, are virtually extinct now. So the chances of finding another head of this quality are virtually zero. 9-foot giraffe, which you can't really miss in the sale room. Quite unusual being a full head, neck and shoulder mount. This is designed for standing on the floor. Very rare to find, superb condition.
Before the advent of photography, hunters would preserve their big game trophies as a way of keeping the memory of their great adventures alive. By the Victorian era, the business of taxidermy was driven more by science, education, and a passion for nature.
It was an age of exploration, and this was all very new to them. So things were arriving back with people from their travels, things that people had never seen before. I mean, things like a duck-billed platypus, which was so extraordinary when it first arrived in this country, and they thought this must be a fake to trick the world of natural history.
The Victorians also had an unhealthy interest in death.
They would want to preserve their pets for posterity, so that's why we have so many Victorian stuffed dogs around today, because they were prolific in stuffing their pets.
Indeed, so popular was the practice there was usually one taxidermist in every British town, but they were not what you'd expect.
But a lot were hairdressers, and if you think about it, there is a link, because if they snip your hair, they style it. They are capable of taking the skin off an animal or a bird, setting it round a formwork, manicuring it, coiffuring it, to get the actual look that you would have if it was real.
Out of this world emerged the professional taxidermists, like America's William Hornaday, the hunter-turned-conservationist who was instrumental in collecting and displaying the near-extinct American bison for posterity. In England, there was Edward Gerard, taxidermist for the British Museum, and Roland Ward, known for fashioning practical items out of animal parts, like these elephants' feet in Nigel's collection. Ward's genius was in making animals look lifelike out of the raw materials sent from abroad.
All that came back was a skin. And you've got people then working in the UK that have never seen a giraffe, never seen an Indian buffalo, never seen a lion. So how do they know how it really looked? It was all guesswork. So therefore, Roland Ward had to give them guidance. Make sure you measure it. We want to know how far the girth is round the neck, how far apart the eyes are, the ears are, so that people then could look at the measurements when they got back to the UK and try and replicate the animal in its true form.
Back at the auction house, Nigel takes a last look at his collection before it goes up for sale.
Cheers.
At £2,000, 2-2 anywhere now, 2-2, 2-4, 2-6, 2-8, 3,000, 3-2, 3-4, it's in the room now at 3-4, 3-6 anywhere now. Ladies bid and selling. All done. We'll go 3-4.
With many of the 500 or so items going to private collectors in Britain and America, this often controversial art continues to be highly sought after on both sides of the Atlantic.
1002 at 134. Internet now. And going, selling.
And for Nigel, there's no end in sight to his lifelong passion.
I've still got the bug, and certainly if something turned up tomorrow morning that I was passionately in love with, I'd find a space for it.
In London, preparations are underway to sell a rare collection of antique and vintage clothing with star appeal. There are dresses by celebrity designers like Alexander McQueen. And this, the infamous Gautier-designed cone corset for Madonna's Blonde Ambition tour. These are today's new collectibles for those on the rich list.
In the past, they've always had their paintings and their furniture and their silver valued. Now, a piece of really fine French haute couture in the wardrobe can be worth more than that third-rate painting on the wall, and definitely more than the antique furniture.
Among the celebrity outfits here are the big star items. 2 of Princess Diana's designer dresses.
People wanted to dress just like Diana. They wanted her hair, they wanted her look, they wanted her clothes. What Diana wore set the absolute trend for what women in the 80s wanted to wear.
Around the world, auctioneer Kerry Taylor is known as the go-to lady for those looking to invest in high-end vintage fashion.
34,000, 36,000. It's a world record for John Galliano piece sold.
When it comes to Princess Diana's outfits, the market is particularly discerning.
Ironically, there are probably more collectors for Diana pieces in America than we have in her home country, Britain.
Kerry is already known for selling 2 iconic Diana outfits, the so-called John Travolta dress and the black taffeta gown the Princess wore in 1981 on her first public outing with Prince Charles. Now she's got 2 more to auction. They're both from the 80s, but are very different.
And they're a very similar sort of tealy green blue colour, but apart from that, they're very different. One's super glamorous and one's very practical.
These dresses are lovely pieces, particularly the evening gown. She revolutionised the royal family in terms of image. It was all about the young, fresh beauty of Diana. So these things that she actually wore are so valuable, so significant, because for so many people, they seem to give you a chance to touch the woman herself.
When Princess Diana married Charles in 1981 at the tender age of 20, she instantly became the focus of world attention. Everything she wore was scrutinised, including her wedding dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel. After that royal commission, the couple went on to make bespoke clothes for Diana, among them this tartan wool outfit in 1985.
There's a charming photograph of her on the Royal Yacht Britannia, and she's cradling this rather gorgeous little Prince Harry, and she's wearing this exact dress.
Although it actually isn't perhaps the most beautiful item she ever owned, there's something very practical about it. And everything about it screams the 80s to me, and also royals, because royals need to have longer skirts that aren't going to flare up. They need to have outfits that are quite bright so that photographers and people can see them. And they need to have things that aren't too weirdly daring in times of fashion.
Practical it may be, but proving its provenance turned out to be vital. Incredibly, the dress was found in a charity shop. But how did it end up there?
When my client bought it from the second-hand shop, she was told by the shop owner that it had been brought in by Susan Barantes, and that she had been told that it had definitely belonged to Princess Diana. So I thought, well, one way to find out. It had an Emmanuel label, and Elizabeth Emmanuel's a friend of mine, so I phoned her and said, how many of these did you make, Liz? And she said, only one. and that clinched it. I think at the time the ensemble was reviled in the press as looking a bit like a horse blanket, which might be why the princess decided that she was going to part ways with it. The princess looked wonderful in it. I mean, she wore a great big felt hat with it. She pulled it off very well, but I think very few other women possibly could.
The second dress going up for auction is this teal-coloured gown by French-born designer Catherine Walker. Diana wore it on a trip to Austria in 1986. A decade later, it was among the 79 outfits she sold in New York in the 90s.
That was put up for auction at Christie's when the princess decided to clear out her entire wardrobe in 1997. It was purchased by a lady, I think for about $48,000 at the time. That was then sold with me again in 2013 for $75,000 hammer. That was bought by an Austrian collector who sadly has died, and so the family have now given it back to me to resell on their behalf. I think that's the nicest part of my job, is actually telling the story behind the clothes. Going back to the Emmanuel dress I sold some years ago, which was just a cheap little black taffeta ready-to-wear dress off the shelf that Diana wore. But in her memoirs, she mentioned that when she put it on, she felt very grown up, very elegant. And she recalled that when she walked into Prince Charles's study, holding a single rose and a matching shawl, he looked up and he said to her, "What are you wearing that for? We don't wear black. Our family only wears black when we're in mourning." And she was devastated. And the telling of that story, all of that makes these things important, makes very public figures human, that we can relate to, and you feel for her. And that's why things are worth more, they become more valuable, because it's not the stitches, it's not the fabric, it's nothing to do with that. It's the story and the history that goes along with it. That's what we're buying into.
While these dresses are now over 30 years old and are very different in design, they're an insight into the life of one of Britain's most enduring royals.
These are the dresses of a young woman who was married very young into the royal family and been turned into a celebrity icon. So she has this very difficult position about both being an ambassador for British fashion, but also having to dress in a way that pleases the royal family and indeed pleases herself as well.
I think there'll always be an enduring interest in Princess Diana. She was beautiful, she was kind, she died young, tragically young. You know, it's like all these icons like James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, they left us too soon. And I think for all those reasons, means there's a huge affection for her in the world. All over the world, I mean, globally, she's still adored.
Princess Diana's 2 teal dresses were bought at auction by the British Museum. Now, the one outfit found in a charity shop and the other from a private collection will be available for all to appreciate. Nestling in this country antique shop is a Jordan mahogany dressing table. It's waiting to be sold. Its inlaid wood and fluted legs hint at quality. It's even made it into a top cabinet maker's book of the time. But could this piece of elegant furniture be at the heart of a story of sex, deception, and a court case that ended in the hangman's noose?
The trial in 1775 caused such interest. It was intense. It was the 18th century equivalent of the O.J. Simpson trial.
The frenzied media attention surrounding one of the most famous court cases in 20th century America is nothing new. 200 years earlier, there'd been the sensational trial of Margaret Caroline Rudd.
It was a case that completely captured the spirit of the time because it was all about getting money, spending money, having beautiful clothes, gambling, glamour and celebrity.
So gripping was the Rudd case, it even took precedence over the fate of Britain's US colonies.
It knocked the American War of Independence off all the front pages.
So what has this dressing table got to do with one of the greatest trials of the 18th century? Born in Ireland around 1744, Caroline Rudd relied upon the favours of rich men and other unscrupulous methods to fund her high life.
She was a high-class courtesan for the early part of her career. And then by the 1770s, when Mrs. Rudd was in her late 20s, she was beginning to branch out into forgery. She used to, with her accomplices, would forge promissory notes and then use these as security to borrow even more money.
David Harvey, who's selling the table, takes up the story of Mrs. Rudd's phony IOUs.
She would run around giving out these promissory notes, getting money, but sometimes it ran into thousands of pounds, which in today's money would be millions.
Mrs. Rudd used her ill-gotten gains to buy a home here in London's fashionable Harley Street. At the time, life in Georgian England was good, and it's likely she would have furnished her house with quality pieces like this dressing table.
It was a time of great prosperity, actually. The country was booming, there was lots of money about, lots of flashy money. It was kind of a bit like the 1980s.
Known as the decade of unchecked excesses and ruthless ambition, the 80s is best summed up in the popular TV series Dallas. This wasn't the only parallel with the 18th century.
It was also a time when the media, the sort of celebrity gossip and popular newspapers were beginning to get going. So there's a kind of metaphor for the whole era of the late 18th century in that, and it's probably one that we can recognise today as well.
In Georgian England, Mrs. Rudd's insatiable greed was to have dire consequences. She drew her lover, Daniel Perrot, and his twin brother, Robert, into her web of forgery. And in 1775, their deception was uncovered.
At that point, the police were called in, and the Perrot brothers and Mrs. Rudd were all, in the course of the next few days, jailed by the police to stand trial. It was intense. People queued around the block to get into the Old Bailey.
Once they'd been arrested, they all started turning evidence against each other. So Margaret Caroline Rudd gave evidence against the two twin brothers. Both of the brothers turned against her. And this became this incredibly high-profile, glamorous kind of trial that was all over the newspapers at the time.
The two brothers were found guilty and suffered the ultimate sanction and were hanged at the neck. Mrs. Rudd stood trial separately and managed, by flirting with the judge or by fluttering her eyelids or whatever, she managed to get off. They could not believe that this beautiful, attractive woman could possibly have done such an awful thing.
Even in the 18th century, this story bore all the hallmarks of a blockbuster.
Here was a woman who was quite beautiful but extremely charismatic. There were stories of her having a almost supernatural power over men. And then there was the tragedy of the death of two brothers dying hand in hand for something that most people thought, if it was their fault, it was only as accomplices and not as the mastermind behind it.
So what does this tale of a high-class prostitute and forger have to do with this dressing table? David believes it once belonged to Caroline Rudd.
This would have been in her boudoir in the house in Harley Street, where she could sit and preen herself in preparation for her men, friends.
But how can David be so sure of its provenance?
When you look in the book that was published by George Hepplewhite, he describes, both in writing and also with designs, exactly this table.
Hepplewhite was an 18th century English cabinet maker whose reputation rests on this: his Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Guide, containing some 300 furniture designs. David believes one illustration, titled Rudd's Table, precisely matches his piece of furniture.
When you look at the fluting on the legs, the action, the writing drawer with the baize liner, then you can see quite clearly that there is a train of thought going on here. And it is, as he says, it derives its name from a once popular character for whom it is reported it was first invented. Yes, Mrs. Rudd's dressing table.
But not everyone is so sure.
The dressing table in George Hepplewhite's book is called Rudd's dressing table. That is odd because normally in talking about a woman you would say Mrs. Rudd. It would be very odd to just say Rudd. There's no indication there that he's talking about her.
David believes there are other important clues linking this piece of furniture to the notorious female forger.
How did George Hepplewhite know what her dressing table looked like? Unless he made it for her. And certainly the date of it is from about the time that Mrs. Rudd was furnishing the house in Harley Street.
So did one of the most deceptive but celebrated women of 18th century England have this dressing table made for her? Without a bill of sale or other supporting documentation, all David can do is speculate.
We don't know definitively, but why would it not have been? Somebody had to have the first Rudd's dressing table, and if the original one was made for Mrs. Rudd, and this dates from the time when she was furnishing the house in Harley Street, then why would this not be Mrs. Rudd's dressing table, the original one?
The public's insatiable appetite for a celebrity-driven crime drama was as much a draw in 1775 as it was for the Americans in 1994. Whilst more than 200 years separate Mrs. Rudd from O.J. Simpson, for the public, nothing has changed.
It captures something of our world too. It's a story about celebrity, about glamour, about greed and deception and people behaving badly. It's also about the media that feed off of that and help to create it. I mean, then as now, the newspapers absolutely went for the most sensational angle that they could, and people wanted to read about that stuff because it was also a story about their own lives and their own desire to have more and their own fascination with money and glamour and sex.
Rudd's dressing table did not go to auction. David continues to research the piece, in the hope one day he can conclusively prove it did originally belong to the notorious Mrs. Caroline Rudd. These coins, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, tell a unique story of the judicial system in the 18th century. They are rare last recordings made by convicted criminals in their final hours before they were either hanged or shipped off to the penal colonies of America and Australia. They belong to antique dealer Tim Millett and are the culmination of a childhood hobby.
Each one of these coins is unique. Because they're unique, they're highly prized.
Known as convict tokens, these are 18th century English coins which have been flattened, then engraved with individual messages from condemned prisoners.
Right through the 18th century, people had recorded on coins, both copper, bronze and silver, births, marriages and deaths. But here you have a situation where the criminal has turned the whole idea of the memento on its head.
Tim has collected over 300 variations of convict tokens over the years. Some small crude etchings, others bigger and sophisticated engravings. It's thought no more than 1,000 examples are in existence.
Even to the poorest man on the street, a penny was not something that was going to change your life. So the prisoner would rub this up against the brickwork for a few minutes, and that provided the perfect blank from which he would engrave a message.
The coins, the tokens, created by convicts. In part, they were created to publicize their story. It's almost a pride in the crime that he's committed.
One of these prisoners was convicted highwayman William Hurt. He'd been sentenced to death and wanted to leave a lasting memento for his family. So while awaiting his fate in prison, he depicted his life on a half-penny coin.
He knew that in a few weeks' time that he was going to be hanged, but in the cells there was an opportunity to sit down and say, right, I'm going to leave my own kind of memorial. And he portrays himself in the cells on one side, and on the other side, on horseback, actually carrying pistols as a highwayman.
William Hurt was just one of a growing raft of criminals who had paid with their lives. 18th century England was in the grip of a crime wave due to food shortages, unemployment, and the social upheaval caused by rapid industrialization. The legal system came down hard on offenders, with a list of over 200 transgressions which warranted the death penalty. Even petty criminals could expect a trip to the gallows.
18th century society did not tolerate criminality. In particular, it did not tolerate theft. You could be hanged for a shilling.
This man, Robert Allen, has been sentenced to death for breaking and entering into a linen draper's in Holborn. He shows the tools of his trade, a picklock, a pistol, a light, and on the other side he shows himself in chains inside his cell.
Up until 1783, the gallows, the place of execution, was at Tyburn. And it was literally an hour and a half, 2-hour journey on a cart, starting from Newgate Prison, the coffin that your body would be removed in the cart next to you. The rope was put around your head, and the cart was driven out from under you, and you did a dance of death.
Whilst hanging was the ultimate penalty, it didn't have any effect on reducing the rising prison population. So the government came up with a more expedient solution: to send its criminals to the new British colonies in America. In 1718, the British Parliament had passed the Transportation Act, under which prisoners could be sold to serve out their sentence as enforced labour. But the law provoked outrage in America, with Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers, equating it to packing up North America's rattlesnakes and sending them all to England. The convict trade ran for almost 60 years, but when in 1776 America declared independence, it came to an abrupt end, and Britain was forced to look elsewhere.
Suddenly, that constant stream of criminals from London in particular to Maryland and Virginia and Massachusetts stopped. And that created a fundamental problem. The prisons filled up. The whole system was in chaos. In desperation, they sought alternatives and eventually came on to Australia. The first ships left in 1787 and arrived in 1789 and set the foundations for a whole new system of punishment and transportation, laying the foundations for that new population.
Prisoners about to be shipped to Australia started to adopt the old tradition of leaving a last message on a coin. They engraved fond farewells on their version of the convict coin and gave them as keepsakes to loved ones they were leaving behind.
This coin is the example for William Thompson, and he was 18 years old, but he was convicted for stealing sheets worth 10 shillings from a washing line in Knightsbridge. The legend on the coin reads, "When this you see, remember me, William Thompson, aged 18 years, 1818. And on the reverse, it just has a message for his girlfriend, for Mary Piers, and 2 crossed hearts with arrows running through them."
What you see is a relationship broken. What you see is a lost love. What you see is a memento that seeks to give her something to hold in the months and years that come beyond. And of course, they would never see each other again.
Most of these people had never been more than 10 miles from home. Suddenly they're being told, you're going 12,000 miles away from home. You're never going to see your family again. This was when he probably paid or bartered to have somebody make a coin for him.
And every coin in Tim's collection tells its own poignant and often tragic story.
This chap, William Kelly, and he's been convicted for passing forged banknotes. It's a very serious crime indeed. Undoubtedly, he would have hanged, but because he's 15 and because of the development of transportation to Australia, it's commuted to life transportation.
William Kelly may have been saved from the gallows, but he paid the high price of never seeing his family again. Ironically, these mementos, meant to be an enduring reminder of lost loves, were themselves forgotten.
They just got pushed to one side as of very little interest. And they were also copper or bronze, so people didn't rate them from that point of view either. So for many years, I used to collect them almost on my own, and I didn't have any serious competition. Now they're very highly sought after. And the development of genealogy in the last 20 years or so, and of course the internet has absolutely brought this subject to life.
Now, 200 years on, they are being fully appreciated, where they belong. The collection was sold on the international market and bought by the National Museum of Australia.
To hold an object in your hand, to feel its weight, its heft, to know that it comes directly from someone else's hand and mind, can unlock the past in an entirely new way.
Without these coins, the memories of the convicts and their families' sufferings would be lost forever. But now they give us a chance to reflect on a time when things were very different. Los Angeles, Sydney, Moscow, and Rio. Just some of the 18 countries that have hosted the Olympics. Since ancient Greece, it's been the greatest sporting competition in the world. In 1948, though, the 4 yearly games faced one of its greatest challenges. War-torn Europe stood on the brink of economic collapse, and austerity Britain was handed the Olympic torch. It was to test the country and its people to their very limit.
For many British people, this was a ludicrous waste of money to be trying to put anything into hosting an international event when people in all of England's cities were still counting the loss of the war.
Now, a visitor's book relating to that perilous period in Olympic history is up for sale.
Well, this very unassuming book is unique, irreplaceable. It's of national importance.
From royalty to runners, these pages contain the signatures of all those attending the Games, held amidst the bomb-ravaged streets of London, including the British Prime Minister at the time, Clement Attlee, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Stafford Cripps.
The whole book is adorned with autographs of distinguished visitors. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, his wife, Margaret, their daughter, Queen Mary.
Unbelievably, it was found dumped in trash here at Wembley Arena in 2006. The old building hosted the Games 58 years before and was being refurbished, and by chance, it was spotted amongst the rubble by some builders.
It's a remarkable item, and It literally is a time capsule of a whole event of this 2-week Olympic Games, which have become so famous.
The 1948 London Olympics was a hugely symbolic and important event, as it was the first to be staged after the Second World War. The last Games had been the infamous 1936 Berlin Olympics, where controversially, Adolf Hitler took the opportunity of a world stage to promote Nazi ideology. He was drawing up plans for a superior Aryan race through ethnic cleansing. Memorably, despite the politically charged atmosphere, Black American Jesse Owens became the first American track and field athlete to win 4 gold medals in a single Olympiad. A remarkable record, which he held for 36 years until Carl Lewis matched Jesse's feat at the Los Angeles Games in 1984. It was 12 years before another Olympiad was held, by which time America, Britain and its allies had crushed the Führer's Nazi war machine.
Come peacetime in 1945, the International Olympic Committee were very keen to restart the Olympics as soon as possible.
4 American cities, including Los Angeles and Baltimore, were among those who vied to host the 1948 Games, but the Olympic Committee had other ideas.
I think it's pretty clear that the International Olympic Committee were very keen for the Games to take place in a European capital that had suffered during the war, because the IOC wanted to use the Games to stress peace and the rebirth of cities after the war. So London was awarded the 1948 Olympic Games, and to be honest, the announcement was met with indifference and in some cases absolute hostility. It just seemed quite strange for many British people to be thinking about hosting a major event like this.
The human and financial cost of the war was immense. Around 17 million people lost their lives. By 1945, having devoted almost all of its resources to the war effort, Britain was bankrupt. Until the United States stepped in to bail Britain out with a loan worth around $120 billion today. With London still bearing the scars of the Blitz, the government felt it had bigger priorities rebuilding the country than staging an Olympics.
There was no state funding for the 1948 Olympics. The state helped, but they didn't actually give money. And if we have a comparison maybe to London 2012, the more recent London Olympic Games, the 1948 Olympics worked off a budget of £760,000. The overall budget for London 2012 was about £10 billion.
With the world watching, there was also pressure on athletes to perform. 2 stars, carrying Britain's hope of an Olympic medal, were track athletes Dorothy and John Parlett. Now in their 80s, they still remember how difficult and challenging it was.
People were surprised that we were putting on the Games, considering all the other things that needed doing.
In 1948, London still had a lot of the bomb craters around, and people said it was wrong for us to have the Olympic Games because they should have been doing rebuilding in the country.
Money was so short, Britain's make do and mend policy even applied to the buildings. Wembley, then a greyhound track, was turned into the athletic stadium. It was here all visitors attending the Games had to sign in. Even with the royal seal of approval, the prospect of a battle-scarred Britain staging a world-class Olympic Games and winning over the doubters seemed an impossible task.
Britain was still on rationing after the war, and the athletes had to put up with that. Now, some got round it by bringing their own food with them. The Americans evidently brought a lot of beef. The French team tried to bring a lot of wine in with them, although apparently this was impounded by British customs.
We were given a little bit extra meat. I used to have whale. I didn't care for it much, but if you had enough onion on it, it rather made it better.
Those various Commonwealth countries sent food parcels for the Olympic athletes, and I had a food parcel from someone in Vancouver, in Canada.
Now, although the games were obviously known as the austerity games, they did, of course, still have the famous gold, silver and bronze medals for first, second and third place in all events. So I think that's one area where the organisers didn't skimp and didn't apply austerity.
Despite the enormous challenges to get these first post-war games off the starting blocks, it wasn't short of record breakers. 17-year-old Bob Mathias from the United States became the youngest male to win an athletics event when he took gold in the decathlon just 4 months after taking up the sport. But the biggest star of them all was Fanny Blankers-Koen, known as the Flying Housewife from Holland.
Blankers-Koen had competed in Berlin 12 years earlier in the Olympics in 1936. In between then, she'd had 2 children, and the broad conventional wisdom then was that once an athlete became a mother, she was unlikely to compete at anything like a high standard again. And she completely disproved that. She won 4 gold medals for the Netherlands, the 100 metres, the 200 metres, the 80 metres hurdles, and she was a member of the 4x100 relay team. And she was just incredible. She won hearts all over the place.
Sprinter Dorothy recalls lining up against her for the 100-metre final.
I had heard that, you know, how good an athlete she was. I was running up the track. Fanny, of course, was well ahead, and to my utter pleasure or thrill, I found that I'd managed to get second place.
With post-war grit and Olympic spirit, London's austerity games were a remarkable success, winning over its detractors. 59 countries competed, more than any previous games. Although Germany and Japan, as defeated enemies in the Second World War, weren't invited, and because of their communist beliefs, the Soviet Union chose not to attend any Olympics until Helsinki in 1952.
So for me, 1948 was the moment at which the Olympic Games showed that it had survived the war, and the Olympic spirit had actually survived all of the dread and terror of the Second World War.
Having been rescued from the trash, this rare piece of Olympic history is now safe in a private collection. The success of the 1948 Olympics, to reunite a war-torn world through sport, is immortalised in the pages of this book, adding another chapter to the continuing saga of trading history.